welcome to another edition of the Two World Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Jacob Dodson, and my other co-host isn't available right now, but he'll be joining the conversation shortly. But I'm really excited to welcome a guest today, and his name is
Matt Capizzuto.
And we invited Matt onto our episode today to talk about a very specific type of art from a unique era in American history, and we're really looking forward to that. So we're going to hear a little bit about Johannes Whisler and some unique examples of handwriting and doodling. And it's going to be just a wonderful opportunity for us just to explore the topic in general of handwriting and drawing. And so welcome, Matt. Thank you so much for making time for this. We really appreciate it. And I know when Barney gets on here, he'll say the same. We appreciate you taking time.
Yeah.
And would you just be willing to share just briefly a little bit about your own connection to art and art education? Like, how did you get involved with art and art education?
Sure. Well, I started out as an artist. I studied art, from high school and then into college, studied painting, art history. I was really into history as well. And went on immediately to graduate school and studied painting some more. And as anybody who is involved in the arts knows, it's not, there's no really clear career trajectory. And most of the artists you've met up to that point are teaching artists. So it seems very clear that teaching is a serious option, and also really not, I was going to say lucrative, but it's not, not a lucrative option, but it's fruitful in terms of getting, creating discourse and creating dialogue and opening you up to new pathways. So I started teaching in a couple of ways, teaching, as an adjunct in college classes, and then teaching portfolio classes for like high school students. And eventually I wanted to go back to school, and I studied art education, earned a doctoral degree in art education. And that's sort of what precipitated my involvement in museum education, because I always felt that when I was teaching, maybe once a semester I could bring my students to a museum. But it was always sort of treated as an additional thing, and sort of, it was just always sort of tacked on. And I felt like, going back to my earlier days as a student, looking at art, looking at things, we didn't have a lot of access to museums per se, but I would spend hours and hours just pouring through the books in the library stacks, like in the art section, just looking at all these different pictures and seeing things from all over the world. And so anyway, I wanted to really just open my students up to seeing more art, and especially seeing it in person. And so then I got involved in I became a museum fellow at the American Folk Art Museum, which is where I was introduced to this artifact that we are going to talk a little bit more about today. And yeah, let me know if that's a good start.
Yeah, that's a great start. Yes. So you did this fellowship at the American Folk Art Museum, and it's there that you learned about this book of arithmetic problems of Johannes Whisler. And what makes this book a significant historical artifact?
Yeah. Would you like me to show you the book?
Yeah, please.
Okay, let me just cue it up here. So Um, just a second. Technical
Oh, yes.
stuff. All right, here we go. Um,
Oh,
how do I play? Oh, let me open that up.
oh, nice.
So yeah, so this book, I got into this because so as a student of art education, I was learning about, artistic development, developmental psychology, and, how to, um, especially looking at teenagers and how they typically develop artistically and the sort of affordances and challenges that they face. And so I was, in this situation at the museum, I just wanted to see if there were any works that were made by adolescents so that I could um, just sort of make some sense of what was going on, right? It's a folk art museum. So I thought chances are there might be something made by adolescents, right? Um, and there really weren't that many examples. This was one of them. And in the end, it wasn't such a huge deal that it was made by an adolescent. And I can get into why that is too. Like our definition of adolescence as we think about it today um, is not necessarily historically how adolescents have been viewed or even how they've, um, in terms of like the human life cycle. Um, our contemporary adolescents are not like those that lived 200 years ago. Um, so I'm not really like that well versed to get into why that is, but um, needless to say, I got more involved in just sort of appreciating this for what it is, and especially looking at um, all the different letter forms and things. Like the reason that this is in a folk art museum, I would argue, is that mainly because of the um, artwork in it. Like if you see on the right side there, these full page drawings. Um, and as you mentioned, there are a few of these in this book. And what this book is a ciphering book, which is like a math exercise book where um, from around the maybe the 13th century, people used to learn um, algorithms and all the math that they would use for mercantile trades and things like that. They would learn that by sort of copying problems into their ciphering book or exercise book. So this is like a long running tradition. Um, and then it sort of begins in Italy, and and sort of spreads throughout Central Europe. And of course, they're drawing from Arabic practices too. So it really begins even before that. Um, and so as it spreads through Europe and then into the United States and then, other parts of North America, um, the practice sort of takes on its unique local flavors, So you have different looking ciphering books in different places. So in the Pennsylvania German context, you have ciphering books that will include drawings like this. And what this is known as is, like at least this style is typically referred to as Fraktur. And Fraktur is basically like a shorthand for, let me see if I can, oh, here it is at the Folk Art Museum. Proctor is sort of literally the style of handwriting, sort of like what you see up here in the upper left heading, but it came to be applied to these manuscripts and these drawings
It reminds me
that,
a little bit, if our audience has seen examples of the old German script. I don't know if that's called a Gothic
Hmm.
script. I'm trying to remember what it's called,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
in old type in German books, with S's having this long shape,
Right.
and yeah,
Yeah.
or,
Fractor is a type of Gothic script. It's a little bit more modern. I think it was developed around the end of the 15th century. Um, and so it's sort of a little like an update on on that sort of old
mm,
Gothic script that we're familiar with. Um, and it literally means broken, but it basically means that the strokes are sort of broken up. It's not that different from the way other Gothic scripts are written. Um, so so Fractor is, and some people might be familiar with this. It's a whole um, body of manuscripts, typically single page documents that could be birth certificates or marriage, sort of like marriage certificates, etc., house blessings that were created in the Pennsylvania German context, typically by in Anabaptist communities. Um, and they weren't, they're not like governmental um, documents. They're more of sort of commemorative, sort of signs of piety, like personal piety. So that's sort of Fractor in brief. I don't have a lot of examples to show you of Fractor per se, but um, this is another page of the book here.
it's beautiful. Wow.
Oh, sorry. So we can get more into that, but I thought
Yeah.
maybe before we get too far into the history, because my to get back to sort of my interest in Fractor, which is not so much as a historian, but as an art educator. Um, I was just curious why, where does this artifact come from? Why is it made in the way that it is? What would make somebody invest so much time and, I would say, real personal motivation into creating these elaborate scripts, especially for something as seemingly mundane as a math notebook, right? Like it's sort of a little discordant with what I think our experiences are of math, math notebooks. But you had brought up the question of uh I think, what is our experience of doodling, for example, or like drawing in our math notebooks
Yeah.
compare, and how does that compare to these? Um, and I think everybody has, probably different experience. I mean, but I think the important thing is that, this was created in a context where this kind of object was imbued with so much importance. Um, and you have to put yourself back in that era where a blank notebook was really a thing of value. And this is like a leather bound book. All the pages are, linen rag uh, page. Like the paper is really high quality compared to the composition books that we got in school, right? So this is actually something that Whisler kept throughout his life, and it's like a valuable object. And then on top of that, it's something that he would have used to leverage his role as a schoolmaster later on, and he used it to sort of write copy as a scrivener, somebody who was able to write up legal documents and things like that. So
Hmm.
it's really something that, like I said, is imbued with so much importance. In addition to having these sort of pietistic, these like religious um, drawings and documents that are inserted in them, and then some cases were taken out of it and given to other people.
Yeah.
Um,
So may I just kind of mirror back to you what I'm hearing? So during this fellowship, you come across this artifact. You yourself are an art educator, particularly interested in adolescence and how does art impact their life. And then you see this historical example of an adolescent creating this beautiful work of art alongside their math problems that they're also practicing and copying. And so, wow, here's an example to dive deeper into the psychology of a young person creating art, and it's bringing together things you wouldn't normally expect. Why is that the case? And there's all these like questions. It's like a mystery, or you're digging deeper into try to determine what were the influences and how did this come together. Is it, would you say, pretty uncommon to find a ciphering book with this much calligraphy or handwriting in it? Is it kind of rare from that standpoint? Do you have a lot of other similar examples from that era? Or
um, I'd say it's rare. Um, it's hard to tell how rare this is in the grand scheme of things because a lot of things might have been lost, right? We don't, because these wouldn't be things that are necessarily well taken care of. One can assume that a lot of Fractor documents are gone forever, because they're paper. And a lot of people would just sort of store them in furniture. That stuff may have been discarded and just forgotten about. You know, especially back in the 19th century, there would have been more um, maybe opportunities for mold and bugs and things to eat it. So a lot of Fractor is probably missing in that way. Some people were buried with Fractor documents. So, um, but in terms of what is in existence now, like what we have now, it's a really great example because it's a very complete example of a bound volume with all this stuff in it. Whereas in some cases, with any rare book or manuscript, they're often chopped up and different parts are sold off, auctioned off to different people. Um, because of the rise of the market for what we call folk art today. And um, so I would say, yeah, this is a great rare example in terms of what's out there now. There are some other, not, I wouldn't say, maybe not from the Pennsylvania German context, but you will see some Pennsylvania German books in other collections. I looked a lot at the Winterthur uh, Libraries collection in Delaware. They have a really great collection of exercise books and also Fractor. Um, and but I would say I don't think any of them are quite this like elaborate in terms of all the different headings and lettering styles and the watercolors. Um, so this is sort of a unique example. It's also sort of comes out of left field, I feel, because it's from Cumberland County, which wasn't necessarily a huge source of Fractor. Usually that's associated more with further east in Pennsylvania, closer to Philadelphia, Lancaster County and such. So it is a unique object in that way. Um, but it's one of many. It's part of a larger sort of field, a larger just this culture, um, where I don't think the author, the creator, was going for a masterpiece, so to speak. It fit within their own life goals and what they wanted for themselves, and I would assume it performed for them what they wanted it to do.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. What I would love to go deeper, maybe in a little bit, with Whisler's art and other aspects of the book. But I want to connect this a little bit with the modern context. And like you said, we typically don't consider our modern learning standards and approach with math as paralleling this um, ciphering tradition. I
Mhm.
know I did have math notebooks over the years personally, and I'd often throw them away after so long. They were often spiral bound, and I might doodle in them some. You had mentioned in his case, this was like a leather bound, high quality book. The pages were a nice weight and quality. Um, but did you do you remember having math notebooks? Did you doodle in your math books? Like, what was that like for you? Do you have any memory of that?
I'm sure I did, but I'm sure it was, you know, not as, I mean, what, usually when I think of doodling, it's, you have your math, probably, you know, just really basic handwriting. And then you've got on the side, on the margins, maybe doodling, right? Like a pattern or something just to sort of fill the time. And there are arguments that doodling is, can actually help people focus. It helps people listen because it's sort of an outlet. Um, and I mean, I don't quite
Like a
understand the
fidget
whole.
spinner, so to speak.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
some of your nervous energy is pointed that way, but the other part of your brain can engage.
right. And even the doodling is sort of a way of, yeah, like anchoring you to what's going on. It can help
Mm.
you sort of focus because and I feel like doodling and writing in general just helps us sort of connect some concrete experience with whatever it is we might be listening to or copying if we're copying something. Um, but yeah,
So if we were to, I mean, this is just obviously a crazy hypothetical situation, but if we were somehow able to recover one of your math books or one of my math books and like
yeah.
look at some of those doodles, could we have understood very much about us? Um, could we have had a deeper picture of who we are just from those doodles? Or is something in Whistler's form of that going much further? I mean, I guess it all depends on the individual, but like just taking yourself, for example, in your adolescence and maybe what you were trying to do, could people have deduced some things about you from your doodling, do you think, from your math notebooks?
Yeah, I think, um, I mean, I think there's a lot of, I mean, we're all sort of stewing in whatever culture we're in, and we're all sort of surrounded by and informed by that. So, there's always these memes, cultural memes that I think work their way into doodling. I think some things are probably very um, undirected. They don't have like, for example, you might be just be drawing a mindless sort of pattern, right? Um, but in other cases, we might draw like a cartoon character or something that is loosely based on all the cartoon characters we've seen before. And so I think there's always the potential for those, the visual culture to seep into what we're doing. I would say with regard to Whistler, his, I mean, maybe we can again bring up an example. Um, if we look at what's going on here, everything is sort of in line with um, the task at hand, which is to do these like very elaborate letter forms. So the doodling tends to happen within that narrow task, like adding these little flourishes to the A here, or this little like wiggly twisting knot work, or adding some flourish to his handwriting in the body of the page. Um, and then there are sometimes those little drawings that appear, but it tends to be a little more purposeful, I think,
Hmm.
than maybe some of our doodling
Okay.
in our books.
So it might not be the case that Whistler was just sitting there um, doodling to just be present in the moment while learning something else. I mean, maybe there's a little, like in some of these cases, he was applying quite a bit of intentionality to the craft of trying to um, produce something beautiful and lasting, and not something that will be discarded, but something that he might keep with him for many years. And so he wanted it
Right.
to be
Yeah.
um, a special
Yeah.
thing. Mm,
And something that other people might see. And,
mm,
he might be trying to impress upon, you know, the, again, thinking about this as something that could serve as a sort of a resume or
mm.
a reflection of learning.
Okay.
So as a schoolmaster, if you wanted to become a schoolmaster, you would have to have something like this as evidence of your learning, because you, as a parent of a kid, you would expect them to basically sort of mirror what the schoolmaster's abilities are, right? Like the schoolmaster passes on their handwriting ability, their calligraphy, their mathematic knowledge.
Mm,
And in
mm.
the case of a Pennsylvania German context, um, this type of illumination um, would be valuable as well. Um,
Yeah. Well, well, can I once again just try to mirror back a little bit at what I'm hearing? So it seems like there was some form of notebook in that era that is almost kind of like today how we think of almost like a portfolio, or people
mhm.
were going to use this, it was going to open up new opportunities. So they weren't cavalier when they wrote in it and just um, lacking purpose. Often most probably entries and things that were done in that notebook were very purposeful because they most likely would be shared with others. So that's a very different, if I'm hearing you right, is that the sense? So
Yeah, yeah,
that's a very different assumption or posture towards the act of writing in the notebook than say maybe a notebook like we have in math class that we're most likely at the end of the semester going to discard, and most likely keep to ourselves, unless if we go to somebody's room and we're trying to study together, they might look at our page for a certain part, but it's not for the reason of like displaying our calligraphy or art. So there was just a very
right.
different culture around um, the math, the a book of math problems, and what he was doing with it. Well, if I may, I want to try to talk a little bit about like some contemporary connections with that, and then maybe some dissonance where we really lack what he had with that. Because
Yeah.
I feel like I was mentioning this to you before we started recording. Our youngest child, Hannah, is learning cursive right now in school.
Mhm.
And she has mentioned that several of her friends who go to different schools can't read her cursive writing. They haven't learned cursive. And so she sent them messages before, and they are telling her, like, what are you saying? And so she's come to Katie, my wife, and said, like, why are we learning this in school? Why is this important if not everybody can read it? And I was thinking, oh, like one of the unintended consequences of us um, being so tied in with keyboards and typing is we have truly stepped away from the practice of handwriting, and we're losing that art. Maybe not all of us, but large swaths of our maybe population aren't thinking about that. I know for me personally, I do much more typing than handwriting. Um,
Mhm.
but the
Same.
counterpoint to that, I still feel like I've watched all of my kids um, doodling, and I've mentioned this to you before. Like I work in a church context, and so like sometimes I'll watch them doodling in church, like, or if I go up and I'm sharing a message, sometimes when I come back, I'll notice what they wrote when I was talking. And it's interesting to see a word or a phrase pop up in the art sometimes. I particularly, my wife Katie, we have like a bulletin that has information in it, but then she'll often doodle in the little notes section of that. And for me, I've come to like depend on looking at that sometimes to think like, what was heard, what jumped out to her, was that a good message? I don't know. And sometimes I'll look at the doodle and I'll think, well, that jumped out to her, and that's a point that I thought was really important, I'm glad. Or she embellished this particular thing. And so I feel like,
Right.
and we haven't really jumped into this yet, but the dimension of in that case, writing, connecting with thought and grounding us, like you said, with what we're hearing, but then also connecting it with the part of Whisler's background too. Of there can be a connection with spirituality, that writing can be a form of expression of presence, or like a spiritual practice, or a sense of being present, and it being a holy moment or a meaningful moment that you are more able to enter into by the act of writing or drawing. Like thinking back, like you mentioned before, I think the illuminated manuscript tradition, like the act of
Mhm.
of recording scripture and copying it was a spiritual practice. And the way that the manuscripts were illuminated were meant to enhance the reader's awe and appreciation of the words and of God. So, it's like maybe a ripe area to say, like, even today, in the subtle little context of my small little church in Ohio, I can see some form of this connection between this writing and doodling and spirituality playing out on some level, maybe not on the level of
Yeah.
Whistler, but so I don't know. I want to throw
Right.
that out there and get your thoughts a little bit in reaction as you hear that story. Like, are there
Yeah.
any like connectors in your brain between things you've read about or you've seen
Uh,
and
Absolutely. Too many to count. Because like I think it sort of points to this I guess a sort of dichotomy. There are things that I think are in a way inherently human, at least in the sense that how we use language. Um, and then there is the sort of way that culture, I think, formalizes it, right? So in the case that you just talked about, the cultural sort of outlet is happens to be like doodling in the margins of a church bulletin, which isn't really it isn't a formalized practice, like there isn't this widespread phenomenon that people are intentionally engaging in. Maybe in like 100 years, somebody will collect all the church bulletins and make a museum exhibition. Um, but there's a long history and tradition of, as you said, um, the sort of intuiting that there is a power or almost like a spirituality to words and to letters, and especially in the Christian tradition, um, that you know um, that words can have a sort of the word of God, like capital W word, um, is a sort of reflection of or a points to the divine nature of the universe or something. I'm not a religious scholar, but um, but then you can access the divine through the word, but also the sort of raw stuff that makes up the word, which are words and letters. And so that there is an access to the divine through words. And we tend to, yeah, I think we imbue words with power. And I do think it's sort of it goes back to something very deep in how we as humans process language. And we actually respond to it in a very visceral way, um, as opposed to a, symbolic coding kind of way. So I mentioned in the dissertation this sort of story, which will resonate, I think, with anybody familiar with Elon Musk's Neuralink. I think that's what it's called, Neuralink, right? The thing
Yes.
where he wants to put chips in people's brains, and the main thrust of it is noble, I think, like giving people who have um, disabilities or might be paralyzed in some part of their body, um, the ability to use that part of their body again. That's very noble. And this is also separate. There's Elon Musk, and then there's everybody who, all the scientists who actually make the stuff, right? And Musk, um, and I just saw this in the news again recently. Maybe he like tweeted it or something, um, that he foresees a future in which we can just send our sort of messages or intentions directly, like through telepathy, basically, like through our minds, right? And it cuts out language, which he says is, um, it's sort of a way of compressing thought, and then it has to be decompressed, and like all this process is very inefficient. Basically the thrust of it is that language is inefficient for transmitting um, intention or thought, right? And I think that's a completely wrong-headed way of thinking about language, because in language is, first of all, there's the affective aspect of language. When we use language, it's just full of feeling and affect, and that can't be, I can't think of like, how do you transmit something without a medium for that thing, right? And also language is something that's always, um it's in the moment. It's something that transmits meaning in the moment. As we're speaking, we're reacting to our own speech, right? And so like even now as I'm talking to you, I don't know what I'm going to say until I say it, basically, right? And then as I say it, I'm responding to myself in real time. And so, language itself is this very like visceral, um, concrete, and it's just full of affect, even though we don't want to see it all the time, and we don't think about it all the time.
I don't know if this will piggyback well on what you're saying, but I just think a little bit about how years ago, if you wanted to show somebody that you cared about them, you might write them a letter. And then, eventually that gets shortened to an email. And then
Mhm.
sometimes that gets shortened to a text message. And now we're saying, like, let's take it out of the realm of even text being produced and have it be like a projected thought. So it's like
Mhm.
the degree of time it takes to express an emotion of care is costing us less and less time. To they say it's the thought that counts, but like on some level, sometimes time invested is also an expression of of thought. And so, people say words are cheap. Well, like, could split second thoughts be taken as cheap, extra cheap? I mean, if it takes just a second to be like, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you today, I'm thinking of you. And like a mental thought, it's like,
Right.
whoop, it goes out the transmitter and is received by somebody else's transmitter. I mean, that's a nice thought, I guess, that they know the person, but how much less time does that take than even, I know Musk would say, well, it's inefficient to write a card and it takes a lot of time. You have to mail it. But, you know,
Right.
but there's something meaningful about the time that was taken. And I
Right.
mean, that's in addition to the words themselves being effective, as you said, and rich and conveying meaning.
Yeah, I think and just I know that, language is in a way mimetic. We're always sort of just, one way of looking at it is we're always just repeating or copying what we know. Like we're almost like parrots or something, right? Um, but there's also something to be said for the struggle of language. When you do have to write a letter or a card, it's really heartfelt, and then confronting the lack of depth. I'm not talking about you, Jacob, but my from my own personal perspective, the lack of depth I have in terms of language to really express something that I feel is appropriate for that situation, um, and really challenging yourself to reach for that depth. I think we all really need to do that. Um, just to sort of, again, like be in touch with each other. Um, like now, as you're typing something, Google or whatever will, finish your sentences for you. So it's like more and more that struggle is being taken away from us. But yeah, like at what cost to, I mean, this sounds very dramatic, but yeah, like we need to feel things. We need to be in touch with that side of ourselves. Um,
So we're at a very different place in human history than Whistler was, and the pressures that we face that limit or impact how we write or draw are very different than pressures or influences in his day. But it seems like you're drawing inspiration from him for modern art education. It seems like it's alive in your imagination. I mean, from what I'm sensing, just looking at parts of your dissertation, like you mentioned at one point, you yourself like to engage in doodling, or you call it meta doodling, and how you recognize that's a meaningful practice for you today. Can you kind of articulate how you could see the fruits of this time with Whistler kind of infusing what you're doing now, and some parts of it that could inspire us as we're trying to learn more about it, like to kind of rediscover or reimagine some of the things that he had done, but now in our context?
um, yeah. Uh, well, yeah. Metadoodling is not my term. I can't remember the name of the author, but the idea is like metadoodling is sort of taking doodling to the level where it becomes more like intentional and sort of a work of art per se. Like you could turn it into a larger work of art. I would say, as a painter, I um, I don't even know if I'd call it doodling, but there's a lot of repetition and time invested in my work and sort of building up small patterns into larger images. And I guess in that way, um, I sort of think of it as somehow related. I don't know what exactly the relation is, but it's that sort of um, time commitment and being sort of lost in the process, which is something I used to have a lot more tolerance for as a younger person. But as I get older and I have more responsibilities, I find that the time uh, it it feels heavier, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Um, so that's an interesting thing too. It's curious to think that maybe that is part of Whistler's, the significance of his adolescence. Maybe it is in there. This time, the willingness and ability to lose yourself in a process like that. Um, yeah. So.
So could I just kind of um, dig a little bit there for a second?
Mhm.
So, like you had mentioned a little bit before, even today during the podcast, but also in your dissertation, like Whisler was influenced by his Anabaptist heritage, which, this fracture was an expression of the spirituality of not only valuing the word, like often a lot of fracture would be of like scripture or verses, right, or phrases,
Mm.
but also like the spiritual practice of writing, creating something beautiful as almost like an act of, I don't know if you want to say worship towards God, or as an expression of your, yeah, almost like a spiritual practice in a sense, which takes, there's inherent value in spiritual practices to help a person grow and have a certain mindset and focus to what they're doing. And so, like, I know you're not necessarily at the moment talking about like a spiritual practice, but I'm hearing maybe you're saying mindful practices, or like taking time. Would you say that as an artist, like some of your craft is a practice, like a life practice that has some kind of other value other than just producing, the art, like it's transformative for you as an artist, that the actual action of taking the time and doing the motions and shaping or painting is changing you too?
Um, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Has it, yeah, I mean, it may have, it's hard to tell, right? Because there's no control.
Mm,
There's
mm,
no nothing to compare it to. But I do feel like, especially like, in my development as an artist, um, I think it, at that earlier stage in my life, it definitely helped to prepare me for uh, what I would do later. Like my artwork back then in my 20s or my late teens was not the same as it is now, but a lot of the same uh, effort, a lot of the same like time-based sort of repetition, that sort of commitment was there. And a lot of people would look at that and say, you're weird. Like, that's different. Like not many people would be willing to sit there and make the same brushstroke over and over. Um, Although there are artists, that are out there that are known for that, and maybe even in a more extreme way. But so yeah, I think it prepared me for that. And maybe it prepared me to see something in Whistler's book that um, isn't necessarily obvious to everybody. Um, yeah. So go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, for me, my biggest connecting point, because I don't have a background in art history, is from the spiritual aspect, because I'm currently serving a church in the Mennonite tradition. So, like the part of your dissertation when you talk about the Anabaptists and the Mennonite influence on Whistler's work, oh, my antenna come up. I'm like, oh, like what elements of that are still present today, and what elements are different? Do we still have some of those aspects of our spirituality today, of where the daily practices of creating something, writing something, are integrated into like a spiritual lifestyle or spirituality? Because I think the Anabaptist tradition today still has this desire in a lot of ways to have like a holistic approach to life, in terms of um,
Mm.
the food that you eat, and the seeking after environmental sustainability, certain like everyday justice decisions of where you buy your products, and trying to have an integrated life approach your shopping can be an extension of your spiritual practice, for example, or your like for him, his writing and his doodling. And so I see elements of that. And then I guess I'm just kind of wondering, like, I know you're coming from it more from the angle of an art historian or art educator, but I'm trying to see, like, is there an overlapping interest here in this idea of practices as a transformative part of life? Um, and then I also wanted to ask, you had used this term, and I want to see if I can find it again, about distributed creativity. Um, and
Mm.
do I have that right? Um,
Yeah.
and can you help us understand, like in the creation of art or music or everyday objects, um, what does this kind of theory of distributed creativity teach us, and how does it help us understand these things and the artists that make them?
Yeah. So distributed creativity, it comes out of creativity studies, which is its own field, like a sort of subfield of psychology. And distributed creativity, at least from my understanding of it, largely comes from Vlad Glavianu. And then also one of my dissertation sponsors, Michael Hanchett Hansen, he's also involved in what is termed participatory creativity, and the two are sort of related in the sense that they're both um, sort of social approaches to creativity and like systems-based approaches to creativity. So when we think, like, a common way of thinking about creativity is usually that it's like a trait and some people have it and some people don't, or that some people are more creative than others, or that there are, some really creative works in the world that really transform the world. And of course, that is true in a way. Um, but from the perspective of distributed creativity, the focus is more on the system. It's almost like an ecology of creativity, right? That creativity emerges um, out of a system that's based on, you know, actors, like, meaning, people who do things, and then audiences, which are the people who um, appreciate the creative work, right? But also audiences can be other, like, peer groups in the field that can influence how actors do what they do. And then there are artifacts, which is the actual, um, the stuff that is made. So there are 5 A's we're getting through. That's number three. And then there are affordances, which are, whatever is out there that allows somebody to do something creative. So it could be material, sort of just like, what materials do you have available to you, that, or resources that allow you to make something, and what is it made out of? And then action, which is, action, what what sort of ties things together. And it's something, there are different time scales that you can look at creativity happening. So in my dissertation, I looked at this sort of system, the ecology of creativity that was that Whisler was in, and sort of looking at the history that predated that and sort of what he was likely coming out of, but also the history after that, which is the emergence of folk art as a field and the appreciation of folk art, which is something that didn't exist in his time. No, people were not collecting fracture as art as they do now, or since the beginning of the 20th century. Um, so creativity is very context dependent, and as we can see here, like, something that was creative or whatever, was created in one context can become creative for a totally different reason in another context.
Okay. Well, so I want to try to apply this idea, if I'm getting it right, to a question. So, like, if today we've been talking about Whistler's drawing and his handwriting, and if we wanted to challenge ourselves and our audience, for example, and we want to say, like, how can we do more in our own daily routines with handwriting and drawing. If we wanted to discover that practice or that expression, like as a challenge to ourselves to give more space for that expression in our
Mhm.
lives, can this awareness that we're part of a system, like that there are these actors, there's this context, can that help us ultimately if we become more aware of that to express our creativity, or can it encourage us, like all the elements are already there, we just need to kind of open up to it? It's not like we either possess creativity or we don't. It's inherent in our system that we're in, right? It's kind of about discovering it. Or maybe I'm using the theory the wrong way, because maybe it's more a descriptive tool, but it seems like the concept about creativity being distributed all around us is kind of an empowering thing. And part of me wants to connect it to this idea of holistic living in practice. Like, is the
Mhm.
system inherently also kind of inviting us to try to be holistic and practice some more creativity? I don't know. I'm probably taking this in a
Well,
way that's not intended.
I mean, it's such a not like a it's a complicated question because yeah, I mean, you have to question what, what is the society that we're given, what do we live in, and what are the affordances for creativity that we have, um and of course there are, myriad affordances depending on if you're willing to take the sort of inherent risk of trying to do something creative, which is that maybe it will not be appreciated by anybody, especially in your given context. Um, so I think sort of also what you're getting at is, um, which is something as an art educator, we always face this question. Like there's a real feeling that people are often feeling beaten down and just not trusting in the process of creativity or their own ability to engage in creative practice. Um, and often because of the sort of formula that we take for granted about creativity, which is that some people are creative and some people are not, and some people do valuable things and some people don't. Um, and then you have some people who are able to push past that and just make whatever they want to make. Um, and then sometimes those things are treated as outsider art or folk art or something. They just because maybe they don't dovetail, or that person might not have the right education or something. Um, so there are um, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I
Yeah,
think like what you're saying is, yeah, there are opportunities to be creative. There are a lot of also challenges just inherent in the way that our society is structured that tell people like, you're not creative, don't do that. Like, you know,
yeah.
you don't deserve it. You haven't worked for it. You don't, you're not adding anything of value, you know.
I guess maybe the type of question I'm asking, and I'll try to ask it in a different way, because I think I was trying to connect it with this distributive creativity concept. And I think I should just ask it independently of that, is like, um, these expressions in Whistler's book, the handwriting, the drawing is like was very meaningful for him. Like, and he shared it with other people, and like it seemed to be an important part of his. I mean, if we've put him in the context of his community, a part of his spirituality, it brought something meaningful and good to his life. It contributed positively to who he became and what he did. Like, so
Mhm.
like for me, I'm just going to put on my vocational hat here. Like as a pastor, like I'm trying to empower and encourage the people within the community that I serve to find healthy outlets, not only for their spiritual life with God, but also to like to live an abundant life and to, have outlets for their brain to create things and to enjoy the gifts that they've been given and to use them. And I guess one of my questions is like in our digital age where consuming is such an emphasis, like how do we encourage people, like are there certain practices we recommend, or how do we invite and support them in taking time out of the consumption cycle to like create or to make space for that to happen? Like, for example, we've talked about handwriting. Is handwriting still a valid expression of creativity that we would recommend to others in the digital age where typing is so much more prominent? Like, I'm asking for your opinion. Like, do you think that's a good practice? Or I don't know if you get the gist of what I'm saying. I'm kind of trying to
Right.
take your study and like push it to the level of like where, like, what would be a takeaway or like a recommendation to have a healthier life today in light of what we've appreciated from Whisler, if you can take it that way. I don't know if that's
Right. um I don't handwriting is I do think that handwriting, everybody should, I mean, it would be hypocritical of me to say, yeah, everybody should be handwriting all because I don't do it a lot. But it is sort of like a um, but I do, I make art and I do things like that. So in a way, I'm like tapping into something for myself that's related. Um, I think handwriting could be one outlet, but there are all sorts of ways of being creative. Like what you're doing right now is creative. You're making a podcast, um, and you're, you know, adding something. Um, yeah, it's a really good question because you could say, you could recommend to people to create form a quilting bee or something. I don't know what they call them, but or take on some uh, craft.
Mm.
But I think what your question is also getting to something deeper is like, what is the meaning of, like, what is that giving people access to that they otherwise don't have access to? Um, is it a social outlet? Is it do they, are they able to unlock aspects of themselves that they sort of weren't in touch with before through the medium of making something physical and responding to it and engaging in that process? um I mean, I think those are valid points as well. um but I think also the way you're phrasing it also makes me think that it's like you're also asking how can people affect their environment and
Hmm.
improve the lives of the people around them as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what I'm hearing you say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is we shouldn't focus on Whistler's particular form of the handwriting and the drawing as saying, oh, we must recreate that, but more
Mhm.
rather the space of taking time to create something beautiful in whatever modern like vehicle we choose to do that with. So it's not that necessarily that we have to imitate his handwriting, like the act of writing and the way that he did, but it's more like finding our own vehicle for expressing our creativity and creative energy in our context that works for us. Is maybe I was getting a little too hung up on, oh, it has to be handwriting, or I mean, the handwriting on the one hand, it slows us down, and it's an art that would be sad if it were lost by humanity, but that hopefully there'll always be some among us who keep it going. But it doesn't mean like we have to lead a charge for our audience to say everybody has to recover this. But it's more like an invitation, like let's try to be mindful to take some time away from consuming things to find something that gives us mental space to if it's a spiritual thing, encounter God and let it speak to you in some way that you can write about or draw about or sing about or just think about. Or if it's a just more
Right.
more of a, if it's not a spiritual thing, if it's just part of your everyday life, just giving you space to think and um I don't know, get away from,
Yeah, yeah.
like, almost like the concept of stepping away from consumption maybe is also part of it too. It's in just giving space for thinking and thought, prayer, space for rest. It's a lot of
Yeah,
different things there.
yeah. I mean, but how your reactions, I think, are they help me sort of think, reflect too on sort of, you know, I don't know, the whole process of digging into this and like you said, it's like trying to find the importance or locate the significance of uh, Whistler's book, like for us today. And it's sort of like I can feel it, but it's hard to really. It was a it's an ongoing process of
Mm,
articulating what it is, and I do think part of it, of course, was the language aspect of it and like the affective nature of language that I wanted to get that through, that um because I do think we tend to be stuck in this way of thinking that um, everything can sort of just be read as like a symbol of something else. Like there's a one-to-one
mm,
ratio between even in like a visual art form, we get trapped in these ways of thinking that are this symbolizes that, this is that. And actually we're sort of detaching ourselves from the feeling of it and just letting ourselves
mm,
react to it um, in a more sensory level, you know.
mm.
Uh,
Oh, there's two directions I want to go right now, and I'm trying to pick which one. Part of it, part of it is about Whistler's background and the kind of Anabaptist understanding of education of his day, which I understood to be somewhat skeptical about more higher, what would you call higher esteemed, like more formal expressions of like you know college, university, maybe advanced degree programs of that day. But also it was like a posture maybe of being a little bit um, wanting to be more this is my take on it, wanting to be more grounded in the practical daily life of the community and less like theoretical and invested in the realm of ideas, which in some forms that can become anti-intellectualism, which is can be a challenge when communities are like afraid to engage with formal study in whatever area of their community life that entails. Like,
mhm.
but I feel like, so I'm not, the part of the question that intrigues me is not necessarily like were these early communities anti-intellectual, but more like what were their expectations for Whistler and the other members to stay grounded and contribute to the lives of others. And like, um, I don't know. I feel like I'm just going to speak from the realm of like religion or theology. I think sometimes, since I'm in this interesting context where I've been able to go on and get a doctorate in theology and um, in the realm of ideas, theologically speaking, you can have all kinds of rich conversations, but then sometimes trying to serve in a like real life day-to-day community, I'm pulled in this, like, I see the tension sometimes of transferring like theoretical knowledge into like practical like service and of others. And so I guess part of me wants to like think about, was there some element of Whistler's art that was more grounded? Like, was it done? I don't know what you could say it was done for the benefit of others, but like is there something, is there a lesson there, like for life in general, like what we create to keep it grounded? And not to say never to say like we're anti-intellectual or against higher learning. I'm very much for it, but like, how do you keep things grounded? And I don't know, maybe that's a trail that maybe that's too far off from where we've been, but
Right. No, I think that's a really good question. Wait, before I forget, I want to plug this book.
oh yeah, please.
This is uh really Alexander Lawrence Ames, The Word in the Wilderness.
Wow.
This book really is a great scholarly, getting again to the
Yeah, that's good.
academic, but like a great history of how religion informed Fracture and that whole context, and gets the what you're saying also about how Fracture was an integral part of relationships and people's religious lives, and it wasn't just about somebody's personal um, practice of religion, but also something that they could share with other people. So that's what I was thinking when you were talking about that, um, is like what you're saying. How do we share our, whether it's religious attitudes or just sort of like values and virtues, what we feel are important. And maybe that's something that's emergent as we build it with other people, but like, how do we convey that? And I think there is a good it is good to be skeptical of highly intellectualized, what do I want to say? Like academia or the ivory tower, like there is a good reason to be skeptical of that because it's often used as uh, a form of sort of social control, right? As a way of telling people that these are the experts and you have to listen to the experts. And if you're not listening to the experts, there's something wrong with you and you need to be controlled, right?
Hmm.
So, and I think that is, maybe not in those extreme ways, but I think it's somehow a part of that tradition, which is that, um, a sort of a skepticism toward a distant central authority,
Hmm.
or the idea of sort of an elite culture,
Yeah.
and paired with a real true, it's real grounded in the belief that the world, like the world given to us by nature, by God, is enough. And that is
Hmm.
what our focus should be, right? And
Oh.
that all this intellectualizing um, could be used against us, right?
Hmm.
um, so I think it's, you know, there are two sides of it. Maybe there's like the
Yeah.
skepticism, but also the
Yeah.
idea that there is a real practice there, as you said, a really down to earth,
Hmm.
person to person practice
Yes.
that builds things.
Yeah, I feel like in my ideal world, the best fruits of like research and intellectual discourse are used in the service of the community and are translated and explained in ways that people can benefit from them. And it's not like used as a mechanism for control or separation or creating walls between people or stratifications and social status. But ideally, the best insights and knowledge that we have can help other people. So, like, I think it's good not to pit them against each other and say it's one or the other. Like, I think ideally, an integrated life could mean we learn the most we can and use our mind as much as we can, but then we also use our heart and like try to serve other people at the same time. um, but and that and this is the second part and this may lead us to the end of the podcast, is about a quote that you listed when Whisler's book was sold in the 1980s. I believe there was an auction, and one of the appraisers had this quote that he said, and I'm going to try to reproduce it here, and you can correct it if you would, something along the lines of like a person who works with their hands is a laborer, and then
Mm.
a person who works with their hands and their head is a artisan, or wait, no, is a what is it called? Apprentice. No, what is that called? When you do apprenticeship, you become a what is that
I
term?
forget, is it
But
craftsman?
anyway, but the
Is that
third level was like a person who works with their head and their hands and their heart is an artist. And I think
right?
he said that
That's
before the auction of this work.
right.
Is that
Yeah, and I
accurate?
believe, yeah, I think that was Clarence Spone, if I'm remembering. Yeah, he was like the person that appraised the work. I think he was reciting or sort of paraphrasing something by John Ruskin.
Okay.
That was the quote. Um, but yeah, you got it.
So
Something about someone who works with their head, their hands, and their heart is an artist. I think that was the
yeah, and I guess I mean for me, and I noticed the title of your dissertation talks about the hands of Johannes Whisler. I think, right?
Mhm.
Isn't that part of the title? So
Right.
like he was working with his hands, like we see the fruits of that in this book. But these other parts of him were engaged too, his mind and his heart. Um, and maybe just kind of as a, I've mentioned this several times on the podcast, but when my dad was living, I remember he met my dissertation advisor at my graduation, and he said, the thing I like about Jacob is he loves God from here, and he pointed to my heart. And then my dissertation advisor, without missing a beat, quickly pointed to my head, and he said, and he also loves God from here. And so it was this awkward moment of like two people pointing at different parts of my um of me. But like I always go back to that experience, and I think about this idea of integration, and like a rich fulfilled life is when we're engaged with our hands, we're engaged with our heart, we're engaged with our mind, and there's like some healthy outlet for what we're doing, and it serves other people. And so I don't know, I feel like there's elements of that in the story of, I mean, just, and part of what we said about Johannes Wissler, and seems like there are elements of that in your own interest. I don't know. I don't know if there's a way to kind of close with that, but do you have any thoughts if you think about this idea of integrating heart and mind and hands, or like the outwork of your own journey? Um,
Yeah, I think you know, I mean, I don't mean to, it's very easy to be like down on what's going on in the world right now and how how things are organized, but um, just again thinking about is there a is are things organized in such a way where we can do, work, integrate all these parts of ourselves that we want to do. And I think it's especially challenging um, for us today because there are a lot of forces that sort of are trying to sort of get us to divest our handiwork from where our heart is or what our mind is thinking about, right? Or vice versa in any direction. Um, and I think if you're lucky enough to be in a field where you can do something that you think is true to your heart or your what you think is virtuous, then that's a really valuable thing, and I think everybody should be allowed that opportunity. And being an educator is very very much an outlet for in that way for me, just being able to um, sort of reach as many people as I can and give them the opportunities to um, create things and engage in works of art. And but I also, uh, I try to also be a little bit skeptical, like that I'm not just um, that I'm not just forcing or, trying to enculturate people into some sort of foreign or value system. I mean, there's like high art. I work in the world of museum education and with things that come from a very elite class and through, a long historical time frame. And it's really important to have a critical stance on that and make sure that we're not just sort of, again, holding that up as like the standard, like the gold standard of culture, right? And that that when we look at things from culture, we look at things from like Western culture or elite culture, it's not necessarily only a critical stance, but also that we're using all this stuff for what we're creating in the here and now, and we can use it in whatever way serves us to create whatever world we want to live in the future, right? So, I think there's something to be said for what modernism did was, in a way, kick us off into like a way of doing that, into sort of stripping away a lot of cultural assumptions. And in a lot of ways, it replaced those with others. But yeah, I think it sort of gives us an outlet onto using the past, learning from the past, and applying it to what we want our future to be.
Wow. Yeah, that's really well said. Thank you very much, Matt. And I want to thank you again for taking this time to be on the podcast. It ends up Barney wasn't able to join us, but I hope one of these days you'll get to meet him. But
Hi, Barney.
yes, that's right. Thanks so much. And I also want to thank our audience, those who are watching the YouTube video or who are maybe listening to the audio version of the podcast. Thank you for coming along on this journey with us and listening in on this conversation. And we hope that you glean something from it, that it's meaningful to you and continues to speak to you even after you're done listening, and that we all can learn something and grow in our appreciation just from the time that we spent together today. So thanks again, and until next time, goodbye.